When I say mummies, which country comes to mind? Egypt, right? But guess what? The world's oldest mummies have been found in Southeast Asia, from burial sites in China, Vietnam, and Indonesia.
When most people hear the word mummy, they instantly think of Egypt. Massive pyramids, golden tombs, and pharaohs preserved for thousands of years. But what if I told you that one of the greatest mummy discoveries in history wasn't made anywhere near the Nile? Hidden beneath the endless sands of western China, archaeologists uncovered perfectly preserved bodies nearly 4,000 years old. Their faces still looked human. Their hair remained untouched. Even their eyelashes survived. But the biggest mystery wasn't how they were preserved, it was who they were. They had features unlike anyone historians expected to find in ancient China, leaving experts with a question that remained unanswered for decades. And the deeper scientists investigated, the stranger the mystery became. Because this desert wasn't just hiding ancient bodies, it was hiding a forgotten chapter of human history. The place where these mummies were discovered is known as the Taklamakan Desert, one of the harshest environments on Earth. Local legends describe it as the place you enter but never leave, a sea of sand stretching for hundreds of miles and surrounded by towering mountain ranges. Rain is almost non-existent, temperatures swing between brutal heat and freezing cold, and almost nothing survives for long. Yet somehow, this unforgiving landscape became one of the greatest natural preservation chambers ever discovered. Instead of destroying everything buried beneath it, the desert did the exact opposite. Its incredibly dry air and salt-rich soil slowly removed every drop of moisture from the bodies, preserving them in astonishing detail. And thanks to that strange combination of nature, the people buried there were about to tell a story nobody expected. In 1980, Chinese archaeologists weren't searching for one of history's greatest mysteries. They were filming a documentary about the ancient Silk Road when they uncovered something extraordinary. Just beneath the desert sand lay the body of a woman who had been buried for nearly 4,000 years. She became known as the Beauty of Lulan, and unlike most ancient human remains, her face was still remarkably recognizable. Her skin had survived, her hair remained in place, and even the smallest facial details were still visible after thousands of years. It was as if the desert had frozen time itself. But the real surprise came when researchers looked closer. This woman didn't resemble the ancient populations historians expected to find in Western China. Her appearance immediately raised a question that would puzzle scientists for decades. And as more graves were uncovered, the mystery only became even more difficult to explain. The discovery of the Beauty of Lulan was only the beginning. Far deeper inside the desert, archaeologists uncovered an even stranger place known as the Shoha Cemetery. What they found looked unlike any burial ground ever discovered. Instead of ordinary graves, the dead had been placed inside wooden coffins shaped like small boats, carefully sealed with animal hides. Rising above each grave stood tall wooden poles, creating an eerie forest in the middle of the empty desert. Even today, archaeologists still debate the meaning of those unusual markers. Inside the graves, the preservation was astonishing. Hair, clothing, and even delicate eyelashes remained almost untouched. Every new burial seemed to raise more questions than answers, making it clear that these people followed traditions completely different from those of neighboring civilizations. But the greatest mystery wasn't the cemetery itself, it was the people buried inside it. The deeper archaeologists looked, the stranger the mystery became. These weren't just exceptionally preserved bodies, they looked completely different from what anyone expected to find in the heart of ancient Asia. Many of the individuals were unusually tall, with long narrow noses, deep-set eyes, and hair ranging from light blonde to reddish-brown. Some even appeared as though they could have stepped out of prehistoric Europe rather than a remote Chinese desert. At first glance, it seemed obvious that these people must have traveled from somewhere far to the west. That assumption quickly became the leading explanation among researchers. But appearances can be incredibly misleading. While their faces suggested one story, the evidence hidden beneath the surface was preparing to tell a completely different one. And the next discovery only made that contradiction even harder to ignore. It wasn't only their faces that surprised researchers. Their clothing told an equally puzzling story. Instead of wearing simple animal skins, these people were buried in carefully woven wool garments, thick felt hats, warm cloaks, and boots lined with fur. Some of the fabric even displayed weaving patterns that looked remarkably similar to textiles found thousands of miles away in Bronze Age Europe. The craftsmanship suggested a community with advanced skills and long-established traditions rather than a small group struggling to survive in one of the world's harshest deserts. Every new artifact seemed to strengthen the belief that these people had arrived from somewhere else. To many scientists, the answer appeared obvious, but one detail kept refusing to fit that theory, and it was hidden inside nearly every grave they uncovered. As archaeologists carefully examined the graves, they noticed something unusual. Many of the bodies had small bundles of a plant called ephedra placed beside them. It wasn't there by accident. The same plant appeared repeatedly throughout the cemetery, suggesting it held special meaning for these ancient people. Some researchers believe it may have been valued for its medicinal properties properties, while others think it played a role in religious ceremonies or burial rituals. The truth is, no one knows for certain because these people left behind no written records explaining their beliefs. All that remains is a pattern repeated over hundreds of burials, proving that whoever lived here followed traditions passed down for generations. But the greatest mystery wasn't what they buried with the dead, it was when these people were living, because according to history, they shouldn't have been there at all. The timeline made the mystery even more confusing. These mummies were buried more than 1,000 years before the Silk Road connected east and west. They also lived centuries before the Han Chinese established control over the region and long before the arrival of the Uyghur communities that later called this land home. In other words, these people existed before nearly every population historians traditionally associate with the Tarim Basin. Their appearance suggested one story, while the historical timeline suggested another. Researchers were left asking the same question again and again. Who were these people, and how did they end up isolated in one of the most unforgiving deserts on Earth? For decades, scientists believed they already had the answer, but they were about to discover they had been asking the wrong question all along. Once archaeologists examined the mummies, almost everyone reached the same conclusion. These people had to be migrants. The only disagreement was where they had come from. One theory connected them to the Afanasevo culture, a Bronze Age society that once lived across the northern steppes. Another suggested they descended from the advanced farming communities of Central Asia. Others believed mountain valleys had guided them into the Tarim Basin over generations. Although the routes were different, every explanation shared one assumption: they were outsiders who had traveled thousands of miles before settling in the desert. For years, this idea dominated archaeological research and seemed to explain everything. But there was one problem. None of those theories had direct proof. The real answer was still hidden inside the mummies themselves, waiting for technology advanced enough to reveal it. As interest in the Tarim mummies grew, the mystery expanded far beyond archaeology. Different groups began viewing these ancient remains as evidence supporting competing historical narratives about the region. That made scientific research increasingly difficult. Access to the mummies became more restricted, and fewer international teams were able to study them directly. Meanwhile, early genetic studies produced conflicting results. Some suggested links to Western populations, while others reported a far more complex ancestry. Instead of solving the mystery, every new study seemed to create even more questions. After decades of debate, researchers realized there was only one way to settle the argument once and for all. They needed to read the complete genetic code preserved inside the bodies, a test that would completely overturn everything people thought they knew. For decades, scientists argued over maps, migration routes, and ancient cultures, but none of those theories could provide a definitive answer. The only evidence that couldn't lie was preserved inside the mummies themselves, their DNA. In 2021, an international team of researchers finally analyzed genome-wide DNA from some of the oldest individuals buried in the Tarim Basin. These weren't later settlers or recent arrivals. They were among the earliest known inhabitants of the region. The expectation seemed obvious. If the mummies had migrated from Europe or Central Asia, their DNA would carry clear genetic signatures linking them to those populations. After years of speculation, researchers believed they were finally about to discover where these mysterious people had come from. But when the results appeared, almost nobody could believe what they were seeing. The DNA delivered an answer that completely overturned decades of research. There was no evidence showing that these early Tarim people had recently migrated from the western steppes or from the ancient farming cultures of Central Asia. The genetic signatures researchers expected to find simply weren't there. Instead, the results revealed something far more surprising. These people had lived in the region for an incredibly long time, remaining genetically isolated while neighboring populations mixed with newcomers over thousands of years. In other words, they weren't strangers who had arrived from somewhere else. They had been there all along. The biggest mystery was no longer how they reached the desert. It had become something far more fascinating: who exactly were their ancestors? As researchers dug deeper into the DNA, they uncovered something even more astonishing. Most of the Tarim people's ancestry traced back to an ancient population known as the ancient North Eurasians. This wasn't a civilization most people have ever heard of. They were Ice Age hunter-gatherers who lived across Siberia tens of thousands of years ago before gradually disappearing from the archaeological record. Scientists once believed this mysterious group had almost completely vanished, leaving behind only tiny genetic traces in later populations. Yet here, in the middle of one of Earth's harshest deserts, they found people carrying that ancient lineage more completely than almost anywhere else. It was as if time had preserved the last living chapter of a forgotten world. But the biggest surprise was still waiting, because one ancient skeleton would finally reveal the face behind this lost civilization. Years before the Tarim genomes were fully understood, scientists had already discovered an important clue in Siberia. Near Lake Baikal, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a young boy who lived around 24,000 years ago during the last ice age. Known simply as Ma1, his his DNA became one of the most important discoveries in human history. When researchers compared his genetic profile with the Darim mummies, they found a remarkable connection. The mysterious people of the desert shared deep ancestry with this ancient Ice Age population, proving that their roots stretched back far beyond the civilizations historians had been debating for decades. Suddenly, the Western-looking faces of the mummies no longer seemed out of place. They weren't recent arrivals at all, they were descendants of an incredibly ancient population that had survived while almost everyone else disappeared. The DNA revealed something even stranger than their ancestry. Although the Darim people remained genetically isolated for centuries, they clearly weren't cut off from the rest of the world. Scientists found evidence that they raised livestock, consumed dairy products, and cultivated crops that had originated in completely different parts of Eurasia. Wheat had Western roots, millet came from the east, and plants like ephedra linked them to Central Asia. Somehow, knowledge, food, and technology flowed into their community from every direction, yet their genetic line remained almost completely unchanged. They welcomed new ideas without absorbing new populations. It's one of the clearest examples in ancient history showing that cultures can spread without large migrations. But that discovery created an even bigger question. If they traded with so many neighboring groups, why did they remain isolated for so long? The Darim mummies didn't just solve one archaeological mystery, they changed the way scientists think about human history in Central Asia. For decades, many researchers believed that whenever new farming methods, animals, or technologies appeared, they must have arrived with migrating people. But these mummies proved the story could be far more complicated. Their ancestors stayed in the same region for thousands of years while exchanging knowledge with distant cultures without significant genetic mixing. It was a reminder that ideas often travel much farther than people do. One discovery forced experts to rethink long-held assumptions about migration, trade, and cultural exchange across ancient Eurasia. Yet despite everything the DNA revealed, some of the biggest mysteries surrounding these remarkable people still remain unanswered. Even after the groundbreaking DNA study, many questions remain unanswered. Scientists now have a much clearer picture of where the Darim people came from, but they still don't know exactly how such an isolated community survived for thousands of years in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They also don't know what language these people spoke, how their society was organized, or why their unique culture eventually disappeared from history. Researchers believe many answers may still be buried beneath the sands of the Taklamakan, waiting for future excavations and new technology. Every unopened grave has the potential to reveal another missing piece of the puzzle. The DNA explained their origins, but it didn't tell the complete story of who they really were. And that's what keeps archaeologists returning to this desert again and again. For more than 100 years, the Darim mummies were treated as strangers who had somehow wandered into the wrong place. Their faces seemed to tell one story, while history suggested another. But when scientists finally unlocked the evidence hidden inside their DNA, the entire mystery changed. These weren't travelers from a distant land. They were the last known descendants of an ancient Ice Age population that had survived in isolation while civilizations rose and fell around them. Their story reminds us that history is never truly finished. One discovery can overturn generations of assumptions, and countless secrets may still be hidden beneath the sands of the Taklamakan desert. Perhaps the next excavation will reveal another forgotten chapter of humanity's past. Until then, these silent faces continue to guard one of archaeology's greatest mysteries, waiting for the day the desert gives up its next secret.